With another Tony Ferguson fight week just finishing up with it sadly not going his way for the 8th time, breaking BJ Penn's losing streak with a first round submission loss to Cucuy. I think it's only fitting we wind back the clock to a happier time and put a prime Tony Ferguson in this Mythical matchups video that we have today. And against the man that was commentating his fight, Daniel Cormier. We don't need Tony getting absolutely annihilated for the 9th time. I'm obviously talking about Paul Felder, the man next to him. And before we get into the nitty-gritty aspects of this matchup, I want to give you guys a time frame and landscape of when this fight is actually happening. So I'm making this fight at the start of January 2018, which means Tony Ferguson is coming off his submission win against Kevin Lee on the 8th of October 2017 to win the interim lightweight title. And I know some of you may think that straight off the bat that, this may not even be close. Why would you pair up a prime Tony Ferguson against Paul Felder, who wasn't even close to the rank Tony Ferguson was? Well, I do think Paul Felder has a lot to offer in this fight, even if they weren't close in the rankings. I mean, Tony Ferguson was ranked number 2 in the world, and with Paul Felder not even being in the rankings at that point. However, at this point in time, Paul Felder was 15-3, finishing 12 of those wins pretty brutally and bringing momentum into this fight with a 3-fight finish streak. He had just come off, honestly, the most notable win in his career, elbowing Charles Oliveira's head through the canvas, which made Charles Oliveira tap to strikes, which riddled Charles's integrity for the next 4 to 5 years, and he was being labeled as a quitter. But then also set off one of the biggest career comebacks in UFC history, with Charles then going on an 11-fight win streak, finishing absolutely everyone except Tony Ferguson. And Ferguson at this point was the bloodthirsty boogeyman of the 155-pound division. I mean, El Cucuy was turning most of his opponents in his then 10-fight win streak into an absolute bloody disfigured mess. And before his Michael Johnson decision loss in 2012, since 2009, he was 17-1. So it's pretty clear to say that both of these guys were absolute finishing machines, amassing a total of 23 KOs between them across their full careers. So let's jump into the matchup on the feet between these guys if they were to face off at the start of 2018. Now, as we all know, Tony Ferguson is an unorthodox fighter without a doubt, but that makes him difficult to get reads on. He's very good at throwing looping shots as counter strikes and getting his shots around the guard when he pressures his opponents against the cage. And of course, he has the most vicious elbows from pretty much all angles, which are very hard to see because he switches stances a lot when he's forward pressuring, which then makes him very hard to counter. And all this is made very effective for him for 2 major reasons, with number 1 being his obvious durability and recovery, which then allows him to take chances with his hands being low, or at least back then. And number 2 is his jab. Tony had one of the greater reaches for 155 at 76.5 inches and stuck his jab extremely well, which was probably one of the only orthodox techniques he ever actually used. I mean, he did a great job of disrupting the opponent's pace, and if they pressured, which, Kevin Lee was a fine example of Tony's jab controlling that fight. If they pressured forward and he stuck out that jab, he was the one that was able to re-dictate that pace. And with it, he keeps himself fairly safe, as pretty much all his opposition are out of range at full extension when he is at that full extension. And this is definitely an advantage over Paul Felder, who has a short reach in that division at 70 inches. That's a 6.5 inch reach difference, which is pretty huge considering their styles. But what Felder lacks in his reach, he makes up for in just the overall cleanliness in his striking and the raw power that he has. I mean, Felder's has got a Taekwondo base and mixes in his kicks very well, with both strong spinning heel kicks and outside leg kicks, which would be effective against Tony because Tony has never checked a leg kick in his life. And bear in mind, after the Kevin Lee fight, Tony had a monster knee surgery, like a Dominic Cruz level knee surgery, which Pettis compromised in their next fight pretty much right at the start of the first round, which I could see Felder definitely taking advantage of. And defensively, I've also got to edge that to Felder over Tony. I mean, his right hand, he's an orthodox fighter. His right hand, his power hand is pretty much glued to his head when he's on the back foot. And Tony is more so of a headhunter unless he's at kicking range, where he rips the body very well with the body kicks. But if he's pressing forward and really gets close in range, he's more headhunting. He's not really ripping the body unless they're against the cage. And overall, with their raw power, it's very difficult to differentiate like them in that area. They're pretty much even when it comes to power. The strike speed and the weapons though, I would edge to Tony. I mean, he's got a great switch stance style moving, and he moves forward very well, but the accuracy and defense in the striking I would give to Paul Felder. But the best part of all is they are both deadly in close range. They both love their elbows and tight-knit exchanges, which is where they have both made absolute messes of their opponents. But as well as that, the ground and pound from these guys is where they both really shine. But to get it there, let's look at the wrestling and grappling comparisons. First of all, I'm confident in saying that in contrast to how close the striking is between the two, Tony outshines Felder in both the wrestling and grappling departments. I mean, I believe that Felder is physically the stronger guy, but Tony just had much more of a successful wrestling career before MMA. I mean, he was an NCAA champion in 2005 to 2006 at 165 pounds. So he's got the credentials there over Paul Felder. But weirdly enough, he pretty much never used his wrestling offensively. He hit 0 takedowns against Kevin Lee, Edson Barboza, Josh Thompson, Gleison Tebow, and I mean, the list goes on. He's just not an offensive wrestler, at least in MMA. He just prefers to use the unorthodox striking to find his shot, to then drop his opponent and then submit them there, rather than use his wrestling to get it to the ground. But I'll say I would be pretty confident that Tony could get Felder to the ground if he wanted to, if it really came to that offensive wrestling. It's just more so Tony is very tight with his takedown defense. And looking at Felder as more of a detriment as well, he's more so one-dimensional in comparison, and he's shown pretty poor positional awareness in his grappling in prior fights. Like in the Charles Oliveira fight early in there, I'm very surprised Charles actually didn't get him out of there in the first round when Paul was in his guard. And that being said, I believe that if Paul Felder is on the bottom and Tony is on top, he is in a lot of trouble. But Ferguson is almost never on the top when it comes to the ground game. He loves the bottom position, not only because almost all of his finishes are from the bottom, being, primarily like triangles and Darce chokes, but he is one of, if not the most dangerous fighters off his back with those elbows. He slices people apart from the bottom position. But that being said, even though Felder doesn't have a great wrestling game offensively or defensively, or a strong submission game, I mean, he's only secured one rear naked choke against Darren Cruikshank, Felder's best weapon is his ground and pound on top with his elbows. So I strongly believe, I mean, if you put the maths together here, definitely if you have Paul Felder on the top and you have Tony Ferguson on the bottom in guard, it would be one of the bloodiest fights in UFC history. But overall, if we are taking a ground game approach, I'm gonna be edging it to Tony here with the wrestling pedigree and the longer limbs, so he can realistically secure the submissions more easily, especially the type of submissions that he goes for, like those triangle chokes. So now with the overview of their skill sets, let's look at the physical characteristics and their general statistics a bit more. So in January of 2018, both of these guys were 33 years of age, and honestly, both showed pretty much no concern when it came to the cardio within their MMA careers. But if you're gonna like bet on one to like run further until they both died, I'd be putting my whole entire bank account on Tony Ferguson, because he was a cardio endurance freak. He was some form of demon when it came to that form of attribute. He was insane. But bear in mind, this is a 3-round fight we are looking at, not 5 rounds. I just need to make that clear. But that being said, my answer is going to be the same either way. And I'm going to be taking Tony Ferguson by a 3rd round TKO via a doctor's stoppage. Pretty much the exact same way Paul Felder lost to Francisco Trinaldo in 2016. And the biggest issue is going to be Paul Felder's scar tissue in combination with Ferguson's fight style, with, you know, the elbows just really cutting into the opponent, really just slicing them to bits. I just strongly believe it's to just be a recipe for disaster for Felder, with the doctor being more of a threat than Tony is if this were to happen realistically. I see the doctor being more of a threat to the fight being stopped than Tony, and that's because if you look at Felder's fights in that time frame, I mean, I guess like a lot of his fights in general, to be honest, he cut very easily. He was a complete mess against Trinaldo, which was hence the stoppage. His one and only KO TKO loss was from the doctor, as well as when he fought Oliveira and the Barboza fights as well. He was bloodied up in those, and there were more where he was bloodied up too. But let's say by some like grace of God, he didn't get cut. I would give Tony Ferguson the 29-28 unanimous decision. And that's because regardless, I'm gonna give Felder the 1st round here. I mean, Felder would do a very good job of ripping Tony's legs from the opening bell and keeping that strike defense very tight through the 1st round, as I just attributed to the striking part of this video, especially with Paul Felder. You know, he's the one that can push the pace, and I believe that Tony Ferguson is one that really takes more time to find his reads. And I'm confident in this because Felder is just a much better starter in a fight than Tony Ferguson is. If you watch both of their fights, you can see Paul Felder gets more comfortable early. I mean, Felder outworked Barboza's strike speed and slipped most of his shots with his very good head movement, and that being in the 1st round against a guy like Edson Barboza, who we know is faster than not only Tony Ferguson, pretty much most of the UFC roster. If Paul Felder is able to be calm, cool, and calculated and do that in the 1st round against someone that is that fast and that explosive, I can definitely see him doing that against a guy like Tony Ferguson. Paul Felder is very good at slowing the pace of the fight down and then playing a point fight kind of fight, and he's got the power in his hands. He just generates power with all his shots. I just don't see him allowing Tony Ferguson to constantly pressure forward in that 1st round. And not to mention, Tony almost never comes out of the 1st round cleanly and unscathed. He doesn't start putting his combinations and pressure, like the pressure and the combinations together until at least that 2nd round. And, you know, don't get me wrong, it will be a very close round. Tony would 100% rip the body of Paul Felder if he's able to manage the distance, but I think Paul Felder will do a very good job of making sure to close that off and try and get it into boxing range, which is his best opportunity when it comes to this matchup for sure. Tony Ferguson did that against Rafael dos Anjos in their fight in their 1st round. RDA was taking control of that 1st round, and Paul Felder fights fairly similarly in a boxing orientated way to RDA, so I can see that being very similar. But Tony Ferguson was landing good body kicks in that round, but he wasn't really landing anything else, so that's more to the point of me realistically giving that 1st round to Paul Felder. However, I don't like the fight for Felder too much after that 1st round, because this is when Tony Ferguson really starts getting his reads in his fights. The 2nd round and onwards is when Tony, in that prime stage, was really starting to be dangerous, and he gets the confidence, he gets the forward pressure going, and he starts ripping that jab, and he finds very, very nice elbows in the exchange. Obviously, with that forward pressure, he's getting into that elbow range, and with those long arms and that lead elbow that he has, he doesn't have to be that close to really hit it. And from both of these guys, I see a few hundred spinning elbows from the both of them. If you have not watched either of these guys' fights, or at least a lot of them, especially Felder, a lot of spinning elbows. So I would bet my kidney on at least 3 to 5 spinning elbows happening each across like 2 rounds, which is great because obviously that's 100% probably the best technique they can use for it to be an absolute bloodbath of a fight. But aside from that, the biggest issue is that I don't see a possibility for Felder to get this fight into his most favorable position, being, aside from the boxing, being that top control to land those ground and pound elbows, because Tony Ferguson's takedown defense is just too strong for Felder to secure a takedown. Felder's not that fantastic when it comes to his takedown offense or defense, and Ferguson's pace and volume moving through that, through the second round and onwards, I think will just outmatch Felder's, and not to mention the experience difference there. I mean, the competition that Tony had faced prior to this fight happening is definitely greater than what Felder fought. I mean, if Kevin Lee isn't holding Tony down, there is no way that Felder is going to. And ultimately, that range of Ferguson with those straight strikes is going to start chipping away at the scar tissue of Felder's very, very badly. And honestly, by the end of the second round, he will be very bloodied up. And in that third round, Tony will just gain more confidence, seeing that he's hurt, probably can't see properly. There's a fair bit of blood in Felder's eyes. And then Tony's just going to load up on that pressure after pumping the body kicks. And I think that's going to lead to Felder lowering his guard. And I see him then pressuring Felder back to the fence, landing a few clean shots to the body, and then going upstairs with that lead elbow in an exchange, opens a huge cut on Felder's brow, like across here, which then calls the fight mid-third round by the doctor. The doctor gets called in by good old Herb Dean, and they call it. That's my full-on hypothetical mythical matchup. Now, I'm not calling a finish from Tony, because just like Tony himself, Felder is extremely durable. I mean, he has taken a lot of damage through fights with Edson, Barboza, Trinaldo, and later against Mike Perry, but he never got dropped, and his output would never really wane either, even though he was getting so much damage popped on him too. So I can see Felder having success through the first round, but that experience and the range advantage and the unorthodox techniques in combination with gaining confidence as the fight goes on, especially with that forward pressure, I'm comfortably taking El Cucuy in this mythical matchup. And for a 5-round fight, I honestly just couldn't say any difference, because whether it's 3 or 5 rounds, Tony just doesn't change his work rate. So ultimately, all in all, credit to both of these guys and their careers, and they would have put on an amazing fight. This is why obviously I made this video and wanted to really analyze these two as fighters, especially going up against each other. Obviously, I mean, they both got the power, the output, and the very bloody stylistical fight styles as well, and the durability to just keep it going, realistically. So yeah, Tony Ferguson getting that 3rd round TKO doctor stoppage, or the 29-28 decision after that, or if it's 5 rounds, the exact same thing. 3rd round TKO doctor stoppage. So let us know in the comments below who you think would have won this mythical matchup, and if you haven't already, check out my video on who I think should be next for Dustin Poirier in that lightweight division for his final fight. And if you want to see more MMA based content, please comment, like, subscribe, the whole shebang, and I'll catch you in the next one.